Thank you so much for coming. This is definitely the most packed I've seen this room, so I'm really excited about that. So this is our Sustainability Speaker Series, which is presented to you by Sodexo and the Gaiety Institute and the Westmont Garden and Sustainability Club. So I'm super excited to be hosting Sandy Richter today, one of our own professors here at Westmont in the Religious Studies Department. So she's going to be sharing on environmentalism and evangelicalism. So let's give her a hand.
Okay, so if there's any way to make you all more comfortable, please be comfortable. There's a couple of seats over there, and I'm happy to back up against the screen, and I'm just so honored that all of you are here. Now, I know that I offered my class extra credit if they came. I didn't offer my Isaiah class extra credit, just my intro class.
Right choice.
But we could work that out. So I realized that there might be, some entrepreneurial goals in some of your presence here, but I'm just thrilled that you're here. So indeed, we are presenting on environmentalism and the evangelical, and the title is intended to, pull at some strands here, because we got to talk about politics a little bit today, and that's part of our gig. So I'm going to have a handout by the time we're done on ways to take action. I don't actually have an outline on the presentation, mostly because one of our handouts before we're done, if you want it, is this colorful little piece. Thank you. Sorry. This colorful little piece that I will show a slide of, which is due to be released in July of this summer, which is after 10 years of lecturing on this topic, finally putting it into print. And my goal is that this is a book that you can read quickly. It will not go over 120 pages, hopefully even less, and that you can hand to your parents and even your grandparents, and they will be able to read it as well. Okay, so here we are, environmentalism and the evangelical. We are talking about just the Bible for those justly concerned. As we deal with this topic today, environmentalism, we are dealing, in my opinion, with one of the most misunderstood topics of social justice and holiness within the Christian community, environmental stewardship. Now, this is obviously a topic that is relevant, it's contemporary, it's important to our neighbors, both locally and globally. It is something that we care about deeply, but as I have traveled and taught and lectured and written on this topic in Christian circles in particular, now for a decade, I have found that from college students to seminarians to professors to cattle farmers, Floridians, Kentuckians, Californians, I've seen that the church is largely paralyzed on this topic. 3 years ago, while I was still at Wheaton College, biology professor Kristen Page and I launched a first ever course at Wheaton entitled Environmental Concern for the Christian, the Bible, and Biology. And we opened the course with what was a seemingly innocent icebreaker. Tell us who you are, what your major is, and why you decided to take this course. How many of you have answered that question a bajillion times in the opening 15 minutes of a course? Well, Kristen and I threw this out simply to warm the class up. And we were stunned to find out that our 20-plus enrollment, every single one of the students started off with something akin to, I have always loved the outdoors, fill in the blank. The way the prairie seems to stretch forever, bird watching, gardening, the wild ponies at Assateague, watching common dolphins play in the Channel Islands Sound, the beauty of the Ozarks, and student after student listed their item of connection with the creation. And they stated, I felt God's presence and pleasure when I pursued these loves. But as a Christian, I didn't think I was allowed to incorporate that love or that advocacy for those things I loved into my Christian identity. So I was really excited when you decided to offer this course. Every one of them said the same thing. Whoa, that every person sitting in this classroom would feel in this fashion. And the news was that Kristen and I had the exact same testimony. Why? Why has the church, the historic moral compass of our society, gotten so lost on this topic? Well, one reason is clearly politics. It is clear that the traditional political allies of the church are not the traditional political allies of environmental concern. If you are pro-life, supposedly you cannot also be pro-environment. If you are a patriot, you cannot also be a conservationist. So if you are a Christian, you cannot be an environmentalist. That's one issue, and it's an important one. But as members of the citizenry of the kingdom of heaven, I think we know that holiness isn't actually about American politics. Now, is it? Rather, as a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a people of God's own inheritance, there's only one set of politics that should direct our allegiances. But that's topic one. Topic two, as with so many issues of social justice, we, the Western majority, the SoCal elite, have been largely sheltered from the impact of environmental degradation on the global community. We don't see how unregulated land use and water use by big business decimates the lives of the marginalized. We have not seen the sterilization of fertile fields in Punjab, India, at the hands of unrestrained industrial agriculture. We have not seen the impact of untreated industrial chemicals and raw sewage on the Ganges River system that has rendered its future, in the words of the United Nations, as a living system, unlikely. The Ganges River system. We've not seen the images of Madagascar, where 88% deforestation has left the marginalized without recourse, so we struggle to understand the issue of creation care as an expression of concern for the widow and the orphan. And third, and perhaps most detrimental, has been the theological belief embraced by many in the church that the created order is bound only for destruction. Yeah? And therefore the assumption is that it is ethically appropriate to use the earth's resources as aggressively as possible to accomplish what really matters, the conversion of souls. As a result, the church, particularly the evangelical wing of the church, has inadvertently dismissed the issue of environmental stewardship as peripheral or even alien to the theological concerns of the Bible. So here I am, a professional exegete, a professor of biblical studies, a theologian, and an evangelical, to announce to you that the stewardship of this planet is not alien or peripheral to the message of the gospel. Rather, our rule of faith and praxis, our Bible, has a great deal to say about this topic. And what it has to say is that creation care is an expression of the character of God. In the book of Job, God asks his servant, "Have you ever in your life commanded the morning or caused the dawn to know its place?" Do you love those words as much as I do? Who gave the horse his might? Who sent out the wild donkey free? Is it by your command that the eagle mounts up and takes his nest on high? When I hear those questions voiced, not only am I stunned by the poetry and overwhelmed by Job's experience and the character and the immensity of my God, I echo Job's response. Surely not I. I am incapable of such astounding feats. I can hardly understand these things, let alone mimic or duplicate them. Only the master of the universe can do such marvels. So I, as a daughter of Eve, like Job, respond to creation with praise for the Creator. And when I stand at the ocean's edge, specifically at the Pacific Ocean's edge these days, and I feel the spray of its raging force on my face, when I am stunned by the colors of a sunrise, when I have the privilege of holding a wild animal in my hands, my heart cries out with the psalmist, "O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth." Why? Why is my heart moved to worship by the splendor of a sunset? The staggering realities of life in all of its complex forms. Why do I sit in front of my television set watching the March of the Penguins? Have you seen it? With my 7-year-old? And I am in awe of a God who could instill that level of self-sacrificial integrity and complexity into an animal that doesn't even supposedly have a soul? Someone who puts this believer to shame? What is that? And the answer is most simply because the cosmos in all of its beauty and complexity is a reflection of the God who made it. That would be both Genesis 1 and Romans 1. And the impact this creation has on us is a reflection of the fact that we are made in the image of God, the God who made it. So the part of us that remembers Eden sings right along with Chris Tomlin, right? Indescribable, uncontainable, you are amazing, God. Okay, I've got it. The sons of Adam and the daughters of Eve, we are designed to respond to creation with worship. But how do you get from indescribable to environmentalism? How do you get from splendor to stewardship? How do you get from holiness to hummus? Well, as with all issues of faith and practice, we must submit this issue to a survey of biblical theology. We must ask ourselves the question, do I see this particular value system systematically represented in the text as an aspect of the character of God, or is it limited to a marginal representation, perhaps via the particularities of situational ethics? Well, this afternoon will necessarily have to be a brief survey, but I think even in these few minutes we can apprehend some basic critical points. And perhaps we can dive into some particulars as well during Q&A. So let's begin at the beginning. Genesis chapter 1. Here God reveals his ideal plan for his creation. In this ideal plan, the interdependence of the cosmos is laid out within the literary framework of a perfect week. On the seventh day, God is enthroned above his creation, communicating that the perfect balance of God's ideal plan is dependent on the sovereignty of the Creator. Of great significance within this perfect 7-day structure, however, is the sixth day. The sixth day on which a steward is enthroned under the Creator but over the creation. Then God said, "Let us make humanity." That's what the word Adam means. Let us make humanity in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule. Well, the message here is that whereas the outworking of God's ideal design is dependent on the sovereignty of the Creator, so too it is the privilege and the responsibility of the Creator's stewards, that would be us, to facilitate this ideal plan by means of living our lives as a reflection of God's ideal image. This was God's perfect plan. I'm sneaking back even further because I see you craning your necks. And what was the role of God's human stewards in this perfect plan? Well, Genesis 2:15 specifies, Then Yahweh Elohim took the human and put him into the Garden of Eden to tend it, la'uvdah, and to guard it, la'shomra. Here the message is clear. The garden belongs to Yahweh, but humanity was given the privilege to rule and the responsibility to care for this garden under the sovereignty of their divine Lord. This was the ideal plan, a world in which Adam would succeed in constructing the human civilization by directing and harnessing the amazing resources of this planet under the wise direction of their Creator. Here there would always be enough. Pause over that. Progression would not necessitate pollution. Expansion would not demand extinction. The privilege of the strong would not necessitate the deprivation of the weak. And humanity would succeed in these goals because of the guiding wisdom of their God. But we all know the story. Humanity rejected this perfect plan and chose autonomy instead. And because of the authority of their God-given position within the creation, humanity's choice cast the entire cosmos into disarray. Because of Adam, even the creation was subjected to futility, literally to frustration. That's Romans 8, chapter 20. Unable to attain the purpose for which it was created. That's Doug Moo's translation. Now, we readily recognize the results of Adam's choice in the arena of human relationships. Violence, poverty, greed, abuse, unbelief. And we recognize our role as a redeemed community to stand in opposition to these societal norms. But rarely, it seems, do we reflect upon the impact of our rebellion upon the garden. And rarely, it seems, do we consider how the reality of redemption in our lives should redirect our attitude toward the garden. So let's press on and consider Israel. Now, Israel is important because she stands as the first model of God's relationship with the redeemed and landed citizenry in a fallen world. Like Adam, Israel is gifted with land, and it's a good land. And although the citizens of this kingdom of God are invited to abide upon that land with joy and productivity, their constitution and bylaws, that would be the book of Deuteronomy, makes it perfectly clear that the land will never truly be theirs. In fact, the regular message of the Mosaic covenant is the land belongs to Yahweh. And if Israel fails to steward it according to his instructions, they will lose this good land, which of course we all know they did. Even the produce of their land belongs to Yahweh, as is extremely evident in the laws of the first fruits, the firstborn, the tithe, the gleaning laws. All of this belongs to Yahweh. Moreover, Yahweh commands that Israel reserve a portion of the produce of their land, his land, for the marginalized among them. In other words, in Yahweh's law, charity is required. Leviticus 23:22 states, "When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap the corners of your field. The remnant of the harvest you will not gather, but you will leave what remains for the needy and the immigrant. I am Yahweh, your God." I love that signature. If we had a week together, we could talk about the marginalized in Israel, who they were, why they were on the margins in the first place. We could compare their need to that of those in eastern Kentucky, perhaps, who were being driven from their land, impoverished and poisoned by big business getting rich off of something called mountaintop removal coal mining. We could take a look at that, by the way, is the machine by which they remove a mountain. Whoa is an appropriate response. We could take a look, perhaps, at the family farmers in Punjab, India, who have been wiped out by the ill-gotten gains of the Green Revolution, of industrial agriculture, that has transformed their once fertile province, the breadbasket of contemporary India, into a wasteland. Sterile is the word that the United Nations is applying. And we could spend perhaps a bit of time of the humble citizens in Haiti and Madagascar whose lives have been devastated due to the collapsing environment, due to abuse of deforestation. But because human sin and its repercussions haven't changed much in 3,000 years, although we don't have time to cover all those topics, we will be able to discuss how it is that Yahweh, in his law, made provision for the longevity of his land and the sustainability of agriculture among his people as far back as the earliest law codes of Israel. In fact, he commands that the land itself be given a Sabbath such that it might be able to replenish itself. And if you think being environmentally concerned is at political odds with your community, move yourself back about 3,000 years and see how it goes then. All right, Exodus chapter 23, verses 10 through 12. "You shall sow your land for 6 years and gather in its yield. But on the 7th year you shall let it rest and lie fallow, so that the needy of your people may eat. And whatever they leave, the beast of the field may eat. You are to do the same with your vineyard and your olive grove. 6 days you are to do your work, but on the 7th day you shall cease from your labor, so that your ox and your donkey may rest. And the son of your female servant may rest, as well as the immigrant, that they might refresh themselves." Now, of course, Israel was tempted to ignore this law in the quest for personal financial security. In fact, we have good evidence that they did ignore this law. But that doesn't change the fact that this law is on the books all the same. The point, in God's government, it was not okay to take from the land everything that a populace could. Let me say that again. In God's government, it was not okay to take from the land everything that a populace could. Rather, Israel was commanded to leave enough so that the land was able to replenish itself. Why? Because I am the Lord, says Yahweh, and the land is mine. And I intend that it be as fertile when you leave as it was when you received it. In Israel, economic security, economic growth, and even national security were not viable excuses for the abuse of the land, the abuse of the wild or the domestic creature, or the abuse of the poor. Rather, Israel was commanded to honor the resources that God had given her as his property. even when it cut into short-term profits. And in so doing, he gives them his oath that he will care for them. Now, this idea of limited productivity and limited consumption is, of course, a very un-American ideal. Now, I am proud and I am grateful to be an American. I'm the child of a patriot. But face it, folks, our societal norm is a capitalism and a consumerism that has no boundaries. We are told from the most tender of ages, through every means of communication available, that the American dream is to produce as much as we can, as often as we can, and our consumption rides just behind. We do not stop until we have squeezed every hour out of every work week, allocated every penny in our budgets, gotten the very best deal for every purchase. We identify our caste and our class by labels, be they the labels of our diplomas or the labels of our blue jeans. Excess is the American dream. And as a result, we as a culture struggle with the idea of the sort of restraint commanded in Israelite law. And what are the creatures who Yahweh has entrusted to Adam? In the elegant verse of Psalm 104, we learn that God rejoices in the beauty and the balance of his creation, and that he has designed this created order so that his wild creatures will have the food, the water, the habitat that they need to survive and prosper. He is the one who sends forth the springs into the wadis. Between the mountains they flow, giving drink to each one of his wild creatures. Now, you live in California. You get the issue of water. A lot of folks I talk to don't get the issue of water. It is Yahweh who sent out the wild donkey free and gave him the wilderness as a home, Job 39. It is by his understanding that the eagle nests in the high country. And as any environmentalist would tell us, that the single greatest cause of the extinction of animal species is the reckless destruction of their habitat. And we in America are presently devouring more than 2 million acres a year in the noble quest of urban sprawl. How many acres are there? And experiencing a species extinction rate of as much as 1,000 times the historical loss ratio. The fact that the wild animal's habitat was designed and given to them by God should give us pause. Consider Deuteronomy 22, verses 6 and 7. This is an odd little law found in the midst, again, of the great constitution and bylaws of Israel. If you happen to come upon a bird's nest along the way, in any tree or on the ground, with young ones or eggs, and the mother sitting on the young one or the eggs, you shall not take the mother with the young. You shall certainly let the mother go, but the young you may take for yourself, in order that it may be well with you and that you may prolong your days in the land. This is before the domestication of the chicken in the Iron II period, so this is the only way you're going to get eggs. In other words, Israel was instructed that if they killed off the wild creatures of the Promised Land without a thought as to their ability to replenish their populations, that it would not be well with you in the land. And I think the same might apply to us. And what about the domestic beasts? Well, in addition to a number of wisdom sayings that demand kindness to these beasts of burden, and the Sabbath ordinance that requires that the Israelite citizen honor his beast with rest, think about that. According to Deuteronomy 25:4, the Israelite shall not muzzle the ox while he threshes the wheat. Now, my students have seen this image over and over again. This is the standard Israelite village and the threshing floor. Now, you know this passage. You've heard the Apostle Paul use it as regards to the appropriate support of pastors, where he uses it as a metaphor. Well, in Deuteronomy, it's completely concrete. You will not muzzle the ox while he threshes the wheat. Now, what you may not know is that the role of the ox in ancient Israel's economy was the role of labor, not the role of food supply. Oxen, bovine, cattle, whatever you want to call them, they were work animals in Israel. You didn't eat cattle. They were way too expensive for that. In fact, many villages actually shared a team of oxen, one team, moving them from farm to farm as needed, or they would take turns at the threshing floor. What did they share them for? the exhausting labor required to plow and harvest fields, and then to thresh the grain that came from the fields. In fact, Proverbs 14 says, where no oxen are, the manger is clean, but much revenue comes by the strength of the ox. Now, in Israel's world, grain, specifically wheat and barley, were the backbone of their food supply. These were both absolutely essential to the survival of man and beast in Israel's subsistence economy. And a subsistence economy means we're all barely making it. In fact, an Israeli archaeologist, Baruch Rosen, who's a little more OCD than the rest of us, has actually quantified what just barely making it looked like in the early monarchy. He's estimated the average village's caloric intake over the course of a year. Yes, OCD. And what he has determined is that each village came up approximately 15 million calories a year short. For the typical family of 5, that would mean 60 days a year that they would be absent of their essential food supply. This is what anthropologists call the hungry season. Now, of course, what you do with those 60 days is you spread your regular food supply out over the year, and you go a little bit hungry every day. Or perhaps you go out hunting, or perhaps you kill an extra lamb for the flock, and then you're behind the 8 ball next spring. Yet Deuteronomy, in the midst of this economy, commands that the farmer shall not muzzle his ox while he threshes the grain. Now, in an article that I published several years ago, I worked with several experts, including a third-generation ranching family whose ranch is so large that it doesn't have an address. It is New Mexico and West Texas, to figure out exactly how much a working bovine of historical weight might be able to consume in a day of threshing without foundering. And that means without getting sick to their stomach so that they throw up, which they can't do, and therefore die. The answer was 3 to 4 kilos. In American measurement, that's 5 to 7 pounds of grain. And as threshing could take several days, how much grain is that? 15 to 21 pounds. Now, in an economy in which every kilo counted, when the average family was going 60 days a year short on their food supply, God commands Israel to allow the beast who served them the opportunity to enjoy his life and work, even though it cut into their essential food supply. How would this Deuteronomistic law reflect on the billions of animals who currently serve us in America's factory farms? A few images of Kristen's trip to Ethiopia, my biology colleague. She wanted to prove to me that the bovine in Ethiopia were not muzzled while they were threshing the grain. So, a snack. Okay. For those of you who don't know, factory farming is the practice of raising livestock in confinement at high stocking density. The goal is to operate a farm essentially as a factory, whose end product is protein units. Confined animals burn fewer calories. Their excrement is mass managed, or as most in North Carolina would argue, mismanaged, and their fertility and gestation is fully controlled. As regards America's most lucrative agricultural product, that would be pigs, confinement has been distilled into an exact science. If you've never seen these images before, it's because our industries are working very hard to make sure you don't see these images. In fact, it is an offense of federal law to actually film a slaughterhouse. Otherwise, I would show you a film of that. So, as regards pigs, again, an exact science. 2,230-pound animals per 7.5 square foot pen, housed upon metal-grated flooring in climate-controlled conditions, animals who are never actually exposed to the light of day. These animals are sustained in such crowded and filthy conditions that movement is difficult, natural behavior is impossible, and antibiotics are essential to the control of infection. Sows, who are typically a 500-pound animal, you see in the lower right-hand corner, are separately housed. They live out their entire lives in 7-foot by 22-inch, that's 2 pieces of notebook paper, metal gestation crates, from which they are never released even in the process of giving birth. They are artificially inseminated in order to deliver an average of 8 litters inflated beyond their natural carrying capacity by fertility drugs. A staple of their diet is the rendered remains of their deceased penmates. Surely, if God is offended by boiling a kid in its mother's milk, we should be concerned that dead sows are routinely ground up and fed to their offspring. We should also be grieved that the vast majority of chickens in this country, certainly not Kenny's chickens, spend their lives stacked atop each other in row upon row of wire cages, smaller than a sheet of notebook paper, immersed in their own feces, confined in windowless warehouses in order to produce our eggs. That's what the rage over the cage-free thing is. We should care that poultry aren't even included in the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act, the law that requires an animal to be rendered insensible to pain before they are killed. The Humane Societies actually picked up the slaughter of chickens. Most of us do not realize that animals used for industry have almost no protection in our law. And for the Humane Society to pick this up when they have far bigger fish to fry is a very big deal. But as the new agricultural reports, all of these innovations make these production units, i.e. animate creatures, easier to manage, to maintain, to medicate, and to slaughter. And the rapidly escalating market for meat for human consumption in the third world in particular is voiced as the rationale for mass confinement animal husbandry. Matthew Scully has painfully illustrated this reality in his 2002 expose of the industry. This book is over 15 years old now, and it's still, when I attempt to read it, makes me either nauseous or brings me to tears. This man began his career as a Washington Post journalist, and in his expose, this book resulted. Dominion, the power of man, the suffering of animals, and the call to mercy. The factory farm has not only taken the life out of livestock, but it has taken the farmer out of farming. And we will wake up one day when these great stewards of the soil no longer exist. And then where will we be? Back on topic. Even the most casual perusal of the state of the American farm confirms this. We've seen a revolution in our country in the last several decades regarding the production and consumption of meat. We eat more meat more cheaply than any other generation in the history of human civilization. As a result, in our country, the abuses to which domesticated animals are routinely subjected are nearly too horrific to report. And I find it difficult to believe that this is what Yahweh intended for the creatures he entrusted to Adam. It is clear that our practices are a far cry from those required in Deuteronomy. Even more telling is the complex Levitical legal structures that accompany the slaughtering of animals. Yes, Israel was allowed to slaughter and eat the animals they raised, but any slaughtered domestic animal had to be taken before the priest first. Think about that. Why? Well, according to Leviticus 17, it was as a sign that its life had been considered. Yes, I have raised you, I have fed you, I have cared for you, I have slaughtered you, I'm going to eat you. But I'm recognizing that nephesh dwells within you. In other words, the life of the animal was valuable, and the life of that animal was not to be taken without thought or mercy. The method of slaughter detailed in the Talmud, quote, demonstrates the perfection of a slaughtering technique whose purpose is to render the animal immediately unconscious with a minimum of suffering. Think about these laws in comparison with the assembly line approach we employ in raising, slaughtering, and mass marketing animal flesh in America. Few of us realize that animals used in agriculture have almost no legal protection. Scully reports that whereas in 1990, granted, many of you weren't even born yet, which grieves me deeply, the typical American slaughter plant operated at 50 kills an hour. By 2002, these same plants had been reconfigured to run at 300 to 400 per hour. 50 to 400. How does one go about slaughtering 400 800-pound bovines in an hour. Well, as Martin Fuentes, an IVP worker, told the Washington Post during the research for Scully's book, the line is never stopped simply because an animal is alive. Ramon Morin, whose job is to cut off the hooves of strung-up cattle passing by at 309 an hour, reports that although the cattle are supposed to be dead when they reach him, often they are not. Quote, they blink, they make noises, the head moves, the eyes are open and still looking around. They die piece by piece. Close quote. In contrast, at every juncture, Israel was constrained to consider the life of the animal that served them and whom they consumed, even though such considerations were costly. Have we, who are appalled by Israel's sacrificial system, ever paused to consider the life of the animal that we pick up saran wrapped on styrofoam at the local grocery store or at McDonald's 2 for $1? Israel was constrained to do so by means of Levitical law. All of these Old Testament laws of land and tree and creature communicate the same idea and the same principle. The land, its creatures, belong to God, not us. And God, our God, cares for them. And he expects his people to do the same. All right, what about the New Testament? There are those who would argue that there is no environmental concern to be found in the New Covenant. Or worse, that the New Testament is actually opposed to the distraction of environmental concern. Doesn't 2 Peter 3:10 state that the heavens will pass away with a roar and the elements will be destroyed with intense heat and the earth and its works will be burned up? If the created order is bound only for destruction, isn't it logical to use the earth's resources as aggressively as possible to bring as many souls as possible into the kingdom? Well, if it were true that the created order was bound only for destruction, I might have to argue yes. But a host of New Testament scholars disagree. Gunton, Beale, Witherington, Moo all concur that when the New Testament language is read according to its intended Old Testament lexicon as apocalyptic language, my Isaiah students are all over that now, this language is intended to communicate the standard Old Testament images of judgment, not of annihilation. Whoops, not of annihilation. There we go. And what we are to look for in the resurrected cosmos is not annihilation, but transformation within continuity, according to Colin Gunton. Indeed, the New Testament actually continues to confirm the message of the Old. For by him all things were created, both in the heavens and on the earth, visible and invisible. There we go. Invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things have been created by him and for him. Colossians. In other words, in the New Covenant, the garden still belongs to God, and he intends that it be used for his purposes. What is his purpose? Well, according to Romans 8, verses 19 through 21, his purpose is to redeem it. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. That's the redeemed. For the creation was subjected to futility, i.e., it was frustrated, not of its own will, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself also will be set free from its bondage to decay into the freedom of the glory of the children of God. Guys, here we see that it is not only humanity who anxiously awaits the revealing of the sons of God. That's the resurrection of our bodies. But all of the created order is waiting with bated breath as well. The message is that with the return of the last Adam, creation itself will finally be freed from the chaos of the first Adam's rebellion. The curse will be lifted, the cosmos liberated, and the earth healed of the effects of humanity's sin. God's ideal design for creation, as detailed in Genesis 1, will be restored. And as John the Revelator tells us in Revelation chapter 21, a new heaven and a new earth is in fact this very earth, healed of its scars, washed clean of its diseases, just like the resurrected children of Adam. Wow. In other words, this planet and its creatures are not simply disposable. So, in conclusion, which I'm sure you're eager to hear, where should we as Christians position ourselves with regard to these truths? Regardless of our traditions, we turn our eyes to our rule of faith and practice as we ask these questions. I realize this message is politically charged for many of us, but for this afternoon, let's put aside the politics of this kingdom and focus our attention on the politics of his kingdom. Of all the voices and of all the facts that are presently calling for our allegiance in the many arenas of environmental thought, there's one voice I believe every Christian wants to hear, and that's the voice of Scripture. And of all the messages regarding creation care that might be attributed to Scripture, one seems incontrovertible to me. And so I'm going to plant my feet on this one. And that message is this: the garden and its creatures are not ours. They are his. And our God-ordained task before the fall was to care for this garden. Our fallen race has chosen instead to use its superior gifts to exploit and to abuse. In our greed, we have taken what we wanted with no concern, often no thought, as to what the consequences of our behavior might be upon God's good gift. The statistics are staggering. Countless waterways poisoned, tens of thousands of species lost, millions of acres decimated, unfathomable quantities of trash and waste. Humanity was created and commanded to serve and protect, and yet humanity has instead ravaged this garden. And like the results of Adam's choice in the arena of human relationships, in the arena of our relationship with creation, the results are all around us. Yet in this fallen world, the word of hope, the role of the redeemed community is to live our lives as an expression of that other kingdom, rather than the one in which we find ourselves presently. Our job is to reorient our values to those of our Heavenly Father, to live our lives as Adam and Eve should have, as Jesus Christ has, to demonstrate with our lives, our actions, our value systems, what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect. Yes? So what is the will of God regarding creation? Well, he's been pretty clear. Then Yahweh Elohim took the human and put him into the garden to tend it, la'uvdah, and to guard it, lashomra. How can we avoid this message then? That it is our responsibility as redeemed humanity to live in such a way that the intentional stewardship of the creation is evident in our lives. To repeat our initial question, can a Christian actually be an environmentalist? My question in response is, how could a son of Adam or a daughter of Eve, redeemed and transformed by the second Adam, to live eternally in the resurrected cosmos, be anything else? In sum, if I were to distill the essence of biblical theology on this topic down to a single proverb, you could take this one home with you, it would be this: the earth is the Lord's and all it contains. He has given it to us to use in our need, but he has commanded us not to abuse it in our greed. So let the conversation begin. Thank you. All right, folks, what do we have for Q&A? We've got a few minutes. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Sandy. You did flash a book title up there, Dominion. I think it was about the abuse of animals.
Yes.
And of course, the word comes from a text in Genesis 1, mandate to subdue and have dominion.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you place that alongside the tend and the guard?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Great question. First of all, and there's a handout going around, and Lucas is making sure it goes around, that is the how to take action, which, yes, well done, Lucas, which should be your next question, right? How do I do something about this? So for the excellent theological and linguistic question, to tend it and to guard it. Just at the SBL section on environmental ethics, just, 10 days ago, Ted Hebert was presenting on this passage, and he is one of my old teachers, and I asked him, Professor Hebert, how is it that to tend it has turned into to cultivate it, and to actually farm it. And he made the comment that it was largely context. That's kind of an aside to your question. But back to this question of dominion. To have dominion over it, the first chapter, I believe, of the book of Genesis is all about the question of dominion. I think that is the context of Genesis chapter 1. I believe that Genesis chapter 1 is an intentional introduction to not only the book of Genesis, but to the Pentateuch as a whole. And the question that is being answered in that chapter is not, what about the dinosaurs? It is not, what about the fossil record? The question that's being answered in that chapter is, who is Yahweh? Who are we? And where do we fit into this grand scheme? And so, as students who've sat through my intro know, this 7-day week is structured to answer the question, who goes where? The sun, the moon, and the stars go into the night and day. The fish and the birds go into the waters above and the waters below, the sky and the sea. The land animals go in the land. Humanity rules over all, and Yahweh rules over even all, the 7th day. So I think that the business about having dominion over is a necessary part of that larger structure, and that Adam, humanity, is indeed being given dominion over this planet, the same sort of dominion as the God that he serves has over this planet, and that humanity is to serve as a steward, God's representative, his manager, over God's assets, his resources. And of course, if the steward does not behave like the ultimate owner and master, that steward's going to get fired and replaced. So I do think humanity has dominion, but I think humanity has dominion over a creator who has tremendous value for the creation that he has offered. More questions? What do we have? Oh, come on. Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
I was just curious how all this information affects the way you eat.
People always ask me that question. And the first answer to that would be that I live with a carnivore. His name is Steve. And I swore my life to be with him in sickness and in health. And so my vegetarian chili recipe actually has hamburger in it, which is humorous, but it's good chili. So how do I eat? I do my very best to eat responsibly. One of the things you will see on this handout, what can you do to take action? I think one of the number one thing that Americans especially can do in taking action is vote with our resources. So going to the grocery store is a very complex experience for me. When I go to the meat section in particular, I am looking for humanely raised. There's an actual stamp. I'm looking for grass-fed. I'm looking for open range. I'm looking for no antibiotics. Now, I'm not looking for no antibiotics because I think that the antibiotics in our food system is going to kill me and maim my children, although that might be true. I'm looking for it because I know that if a farmer wasn't able to use antibiotics, that he had to treat his animals humanely. I do eat meat. I'm sorry. But I do my very best to eat meat that has been responsibly raised and humanely raised. And I vote my conscience both with my democratic vote and with my checkbook. And my poor husband, the carnivore that I live with, is like calling me from the grocery store on a regular basis. Is it this label? Is it that label? Is cage-free good enough? No, it's got to be free range. Okay, cage-free, free range. What about this part about no antibiotics? They don't put antibiotics in eggs anyway. So, yes. That's what I do. I also try very hard to reduce the amount of meat that goes through my family's eating, and we actually talk about things. We will call pork pig. We will call beef cow. We will call chicken chicken. We will not hide behind the euphemisms. What else? Yes, right here.
Do you have any opinions on organizations like 4-H and FFA?
4-H events?
4-H and FFA.
I think those are fabulous. In fact, I think any exposure that anyone can have to where their food actually comes from is really fabulous. It shows you that this is not an industry. It shows you that there are real animate creatures that stand behind what you buy. It shows you that there are real farmers that stand behind the animate creatures, farmers who are living often on food stamps and federal subsidies because we don't pay our farmers. Whereas in Europe, a farmer, a real farmer, not a corporation, but an actual farmer who has children and lives on the land and actually knows the name of his cows, can live as a middle class to upper middle class citizen. That is not true in our country. And that is one place where your democratic vote is critical. And again, as we turn around the economic cycle, as we make it clear that we care about organics, we care about local farmers, we care about 4-H, we care about CSAs, which are supporting local farmers by buying their produce, that we go to, sorry, I'm a little brain dead this afternoon. Thank you, farmers markets, that we're showing the industry that we care about something else. We actually managed to turn around a crisis in the dolphin population due to inhumane tuna harvesting methods with our credit cards. We can do that all over the place. I have hope. I do. I saw another hand right here.
One of the arguments that will often come up quickly in political circles is, particularly as you get to large populations, you want to get them protein, you want to get them as, minimize suffering and malnutrition.
Mm-hmm.
And so how have you interacted with kind of the questions of the moral good of, sustaining and the environment while also we do want to minimize human suffering, and perhaps we should have kept populations lower and all of these other things, but we're here now and we've got the amount of people we do, so what do we go forward with that?
Excellent question. And there will be a chapter in my book specifically on that, and I will use Punjab as my, my case study. And all of the things you've said are well-informed and intelligent and great question. If you remember in the 1960s, 1950s, 1960s, we experienced something called the Green Revolution. I don't have all the names and stats in front of me right now, but essentially I was raised being told by my mother, eat your vegetables, there are starving children in India. Well, my mother was right. There were starving children in India and in Mexico as well. And so Norman Gottwald actually launched the Green Revolution, where he biologically altered certain grains, corn in Mexico and rice in India, in order to create a plant that would yield more with less investment. He also educated the locals on pesticides and chemical fertilizers and recreated the irrigation systems. He won a Nobel Peace Prize for alleviating human suffering. Well, Punjab, India was the case, whereas a region of India that had been barely supporting the country, if it had, was transformed into this overflowing breadbasket, and they actually began exporting grain, believe it or not. And so India was actually making money off of its farming, let alone supporting its own people. Well, the abuse of the system, right? So the chemical fertilizers and the chemical pesticides and the mono-agriculture, that's raising one crop in one field over and over again, which leads to the entrenchment of whatever insects like to eat that crop and the entrenchment of whatever sort of fungus tends to assault that crop, eventually led to the collapse of the soil in Punjab, India, and to the poisoning of both the farmers and their children and their families because of the overuse of the chemical fertilizers, whereas a certain crop would have been 300-fold the first time around because the soil was not ultimately cared for. Now the crops are meager and moving towards sterile. And the water situation, where they could drop 30 feet and get a well 30 years ago, it's 300 feet now. And this region is on the verge of collapse. And now India has doubled and tripled its population in response to its food supply. So a very uncomfortable part of this conversation, especially for evangelicals, is limiting population. And limiting population in communities and cultures where the idea of birth control is completely countercultural and is considered a social ill. I have a dear friend who's working in northern India right now. She started her career as an emergency room nurse, and she is regularly treating women who are on their 12th and 14th baby, whose health is collapsing, and they're whispering in the back corridors, if you take this pill, it won't happen again. And as a devout Christian, dealing with this very difficult conversation. So again, greed is not going to be outdistanced by using DDT in areas where we have malaria outbreaks. Greed is not going to be overcome by teaching Punjab to raise a genetically altered brand of wheat. And obviously Mexico, and I actually know the woman who worked on the committee to create the genetically altered corn, pretty amazing. Obviously, we wouldn't be having the same sort of current political climate if Mexico was self-sustaining agriculturally as well. We need to think long term, very long term. And we live in fallen governments, and people are looking to the next election. They're not looking to the next generation, unfortunately. Sorry to be a pessimist. Any follow-up?
Not at the moment. I'll call.
Okay. Yes.
How can we communicate this well to other Christians who are on the opposite spectrum, or even the section that's like, well, it's going to work out in the end, God's got this, so I don't really need to participate?
I usually relate this to the question of orphans and widows. And all of a sudden I get a hearing. And this is why the book that I'm working on, it's intentionally not, it is not as technical as it could be, because I want your grandfather to be able to read this. And I want him to be able to say, oh, this is my Bible. So how do we communicate this? I use Bible. I use biblical theology. I could go outside of biblical theology. There's lots of systematics and current theology that would speak to this as well, but I stay in that narrow focus. I talk about the fact, I talk about the New Testament, that this world is not necessarily disposable. I talk about Deuteronomy, obviously. I talk Bible, and that usually gets people's attention. And when I talk about the fact that those who live on the margins are the very first to encounter environmental degradation. In fact, if you can stay for a bit, I'd love to show you a little video of, I have dear friends who are in Madagascar right now. It is over 90% forested in Madagascar, one of the most unusual habitats in the world. And people are starving, they're marginalized. She is a licensed midwife and he's a botanist. And they've gone in the name of missions. His job is he teaches the locals to plant indigenous species in their backyard gardens. And so they've got their little gardens that they tend like a mother hen. And then as the indigenous trees and shrubbery grow to an age where they can be transplanted, they sell them to the UN and to the various peacekeeping and environmental organizations, thus creating a microeconomy. And they replant their own watersheds and their own fields, thus resurrecting their land. And her job is to keep 1 out of 10 women from dying in childbirth. 1 out of 10 women in Madagascar right now die trying to produce a baby. So I talk about the marginalized. I talk about orphans all over the world. I talk about the link between environmental degradation and orphans. And I talk Bible. Anyone else? Do you want to see this little clip? It's got music. Music is nice. Yeah? Okay. Let's do this. Especially because when I get to this point, I know that your hearts are broken. And what I want to say to you, finest that Westmont has to offer, young hearts that I respect so much, I think the next wave of missions is environmental missions. 100 years ago, we went and we built hospitals and we built orphanages. Now, my hope is that we will go and in the name of Jesus, we will teach these folks to defend their own space and to cherish their own creatures. Guys, I think that this is the next generation of missions. I think the church should be leading this cause. I think this is a matter of personal holiness. And that sheet that went around, find some way to start taking action. Yeah, you're done, sweet pea. They were going to do it without a narration, and he heard it so many times, they realized he'd memorized it. He was like 7. And they were like, let's do one with him. Get informed. Join an organization. Pay for a journal. Find something out. We can do this thing. We're not going to ultimately save this planet any more than we're going to feed every orphan, but we are going to show the world the face of our God in the way we care for his planet. That's my message. So thank you very much.